Hi, welcome to the channel. So iPhone 11 has had many glowing reviews for its camera. So now that I've finally gotten my hands on the iPhone, I was able to give a proper comparison with an older device. So here are what I believe are the three main improvements of the iPhone 11 camera, which will benefit your night shooting. I'll focus here on the main wide-angle camera, which is the sharpest and best quality camera, and the one you will likely rely on to get the best images. And for reference, I'll be comparing it to an older iPhone X. So let's get right into this. So number one is better dynamic range. Dynamic range is the ability of the camera to capture a greater range of brightness from the darkest shadows to the brightest highlights. So a camera of poorer quality and poorer dynamic range will usually have overly dark shadows and overblown highlights, especially at night. So let's take a few shots with both iPhones and compare the difference. Okay, so let's take a look at this image taken with an iPhone X. You can see that the focal length of this lens is 29.2 millimeters and at an exposure time of 1/33. This is basically taken in auto, just an auto setting at night. And this is the equivalent taken with the iPhone 11. And again, iPhone 11 taken with auto has basically a slightly wider focal length of 27.4 millimeters. The f number or the aperture is f1.8. They both have the same aperture, so very similar lens. Yeah, it basically shows the same shutter speed of 1/33 seconds. Alright, so comparing them side by side, basically you can see that the iPhone 11 here, even though the settings are similar, you see that the iPhone 11 shot, the shadows are a bit darker. You can see that the iPhone 11 here on the right side is able to expose the shadows a little bit better, and so it's able to handle darker areas a lot better, even though the settings seem to be the same. The exposure seems to be the same, and so the iPhone 11 has a more pleasing shot because by default it's able to capture more variation of dark and light. Okay, so here's another shot just to do another comparison. This is a shot taken with the iPhone X. And if you can compare this with the iPhone 11 shot, so the iPhone 11 shot you can see with a similar exposure time. Okay, so here are the two shots side by side. The iPhone X is on the left side and the iPhone 11 is on the right side. And so you can see the iPhone X shot, even though the exposure again looks the same, you can see that the lights from this iPhone X shot are really blown out, right? That goes for this lamppost, which is very obvious, as well as the building here, okay? Compared to the iPhone 11, it really controls the bright lights very well. So the sensor seems to work very well. And again, this setting was not using any HDR or anything like that. So it's just the sensor itself that allow it to take a greater range of very bright and very dark scenes. And these are very difficult scenes at night. So this advantage also applies to the other cameras, like the front-facing camera. Let me show you an example. All right, so this is the front-facing camera taken at night. Again, a very dark scene. This is now with the iPhone X. Okay, and just to show you, okay, it's a very dark scene. You can see that the ISO level is actually very high at this point, and you can see that the f-stop is higher. The front-facing camera is a lesser quality camera. For the iPhone X, the focal length is 33.4 millimeters. For the iPhone 11, you can see that Apple improved it by making it wider. So from 33 millimeters, you now have 24.1 millimeters, and the f number or the aperture is basically the same. Okay, so let's look at this side by side now. Okay, so looking at it side by side, again, you can see the iPhone X here at the left side and the iPhone 11 on the right side, and you can see again the concept of dynamic range. The iPhone X really blows out the lights in this very dark scene. You can see how well the iPhone 11 controls, the bright light, so it's able to capture more detail in this bright light. So I believe the sensor just does that a lot better, and perhaps some of the processing that it does. But it is really once I saw it, I did feel it was a big improvement. So number two improvement I've noticed is really better high ISO performance. So ISO is the measure of sensitivity of the camera sensor. So when you take a photo in low light, the iPhone will typically assign a shutter 1/15 to 1/25 seconds, because usually the iPhone will favor a shutter speed for handheld shooting. So what it does is it actually bumps up the ISO or adjusts the ISO to get the proper exposure. Problem is, in dark scenes, the bumping up the ISO introduces more noise and the images become progressively worse. Okay, so here's a shot taken with iPhone X. Again, a very dark scene, so we can really test its high ISO performance or compare the high ISO performance. And you can see here it's pretty much maxed out. The ISO of the iPhone X will really match to 2200 ISO. So it's really at its maximum level. So 1/17 is what is assigned for this exposure. Okay, so let's compare this with the iPhone 11 shot. It has a similar exposure, also 1/17 seconds. So the iPhone 11 chose exactly the same exposure time. You can see the ISO of iPhone 11 is 3072, which seems like a much higher figure, but you have to take these ISO numbers with a grain of salt. They are not really comparable across devices. So for example, iPhone X goes from ISO 22 to ISO 2200, and iPhone 11 goes from ISO 32 to ISO 3072. So in this case, you can see that even though the ISO is 50% more, the exposure is roughly the same. Okay, so you can see that if you compare that side by side, right? So roughly the same shutter speed and maximum ISO, but they look pretty much alike. So difference really comes when you zoom in. So what I'm gonna do here is just zoom in on one part, which is really this flower pot here. So let's just take a look at the difference. Okay, so here is the zoomed in flower pot. Okay, again, this is at max ISO. So you have the iPhone 11 in this case on the left side and the iPhone X on the right side. And I think you can see from your screen that iPhone 11 maintains much better detail and contrast in the highest ISO. So you can see that iPhone 10 on the right side, there's less detail because of the noise reduction, because the image has so much noise, and the noise reduction really makes the image look muddy. Okay, so let's take a look at another high ISO shot here. Why is it high ISO? Because I was shooting this handheld. Again, it's maxed out, right? 2112 for iPhone 10. Okay, so iPhone 11 basically chose a slightly different exposure, but still a very high ISO. Okay, let's compare them side by side. Okay, so comparing them side by side, the exposures again are roughly the same. Again, you have iPhone 10 here on the right side and iPhone 11 on the left side. And so again, we're going to zoom into the small window here at the top just to compare the difference. Okay, so here it is. When we zoom in side by side, again, you can see much more detail. So you can even see from here the details on the window, inside the window, right? So the colors here are more visible. You can look at this grid here or this fence. You can see the detail here on the fence, and here basically you can't see any detail. So that is the high ISO performance. So number 3, this actually has been around since iPhone XS, but I just like to talk about it if you're coming from an iPhone 10 or older. It's useful to note that iPhone 11 has a much longer exposure time of 1 second versus 0.3 seconds for iPhone 10. Now this is super useful in really low light when you want to maintain a certain image quality by keeping the ISO low. So let's take a few shots to demo this. This is the shot taken with maximum exposure time for the iPhone X. As you can see, it is 0.3 seconds. To get this exposure by having the ISO at 70, all right, which is pretty low. Okay, so let's compare this with the iPhone 11. So you see the iPhone 11 has a maximum exposure time of 1 second. So the benefit of that is you're able to reduce the ISO to just 32, which is actually the minimum ISO for the iPhone 11. Much better quality. No, if you zoom in to the shot, you would have much less noise. Just remember that higher ISOs will introduce more noise. So keeping it low like this is actually a good thing. Now, of course, if you're shooting at 1 second, you need to brace the phone. You can't shoot handheld when you have the setting. Okay, so here's another sample. 0.3 seconds for iPhone X. Again, pretty good shot. Much less noise, right? Than if you would hand hold it you'll probably pick something like 300 or 400, and then you would have a lot more noise in that shot. Okay, so this is the same shot again with 1 second with the iPhone 11. Okay, so here is a shot this is in a park, a very dark scene. Okay, even though I've increased it to the maximum exposure time, you can see the ISO is still 200, okay, which is decent, but that will introduce already some noise into the shot. So this is roughly the same scene taken with the iPhone 11. You can see that because it's very dark, I was able to double the exposure time to around 0.7 seconds. So that's twice more light than the iPhone 10. Okay, so this is a scene which I zoomed in just to be able to compare this properly. You can see here that the iPhone 11, because I was able to let in more light, I was able to achieve a better quality shot. A double the amount of light to be let in, and that gives like the cleaner quality, right? So you see the details at these lower ISOs much more apparent for iPhone 11. So what's the bottom line? I think the bottom line here is iPhone 11 is a definite improvement, especially if you're coming from an older device like an iPhone 10 or older. The images you're gonna get, even in auto, is already a big improvement, and that's because of the dynamic range. It's already better, it's high ISO performance, and if you know how to take advantage of manual apps to control the ISO and shutter speed, you can also control the quality that you are actually getting with an iPhone 11. Right, so if you found this video helpful, do help out the channel by giving us a like or even subscribing. Or if you have your iPhone XS and an 11 and you've compared it, is it a big difference as well? Yeah, so you can share your thoughts on that. So till next time, happy shooting!